The first clue that Elena was more than she appeared didn't come from the storms, or the torn canvas she stitched shut night after night. It came from the battered trunk no one dared touch, wedged beneath a stack of moldy tarps in the far corner of the depot, its hinges rusted, its lock older than most of the workers who passed it by. They thought it was just scrap, another forgotten relic from the endless deliveries that came and went. But if you've ever believed that sometimes the quietest people are carrying the heaviest pasts, make sure to like and subscribe, because Elena's story proves it. She was 28, thin from years of long hours, her face drawn but still marked with the stubborn beauty of someone who hadn't given up. Most people in the camp saw her as just another worker, the woman with her sleeves rolled up, covered in glue and patches, kneeling in the mud to fix yet another leaking tent so food and medicine wouldn't rot in the rain. Nothing glamorous, nothing heroic, just calloused hands and sore knees. But those who looked closer might have noticed the way she moved. Never clumsy, always scanning, always aware. She patched holes in fabric like she'd once patched holes in people. She tied knots as if they were lifelines. And though she rarely spoke, when she did, her voice carried a weight that made even the loudest men pause. At 28, she should have been in her prime, chasing careers or dreams like the other young staff who joked and flirted under the floodlights. Instead, Elena stayed behind, working long after others had gone. The last one sweeping rainwater from the supply aisles, the last one tugging ropes tight, so canvas wouldn't collapse in the night. She never complained. She never explained. And maybe that's why the whispers started. She wasted her youth, some said. She's hiding from something, others murmured. But no one asked her outright, because there was something in her eyes that made them stop, something that hinted at a history they couldn't put into words. She would smile politely, but her gaze always drifted back to the horizon, as though waiting for a message only she could read. The depot itself was a strange place, half humanitarian hub, half forgotten outpost. A sprawl of storage tents pitched against the endless winds, with canvas walls flapping like lungs that never found rest. Food, medicine, blankets, even clean water, it all came through here before being sent out to villages still clawing their way back from disaster. And without Elena, much of it would have spoiled. She knew the angles of every pool, the weak points of every tarp. She could tell, from the smell of damp canvas alone, how close a leak was to giving way. The others laughed when she carried patches in her pocket like some kind of badge, but when the storms hit, they didn't laugh. They ran for cover while she fought against the rain. You see, Elena wasn't afraid of storms. She wasn't afraid of work that broke her back. She wasn't afraid of being unseen. What unsettled her, what gnawed at her most, was being underestimated, treated as if she was nothing more than the woman with glue on her fingers and mud on her boots. Because the truth was, years ago, she had been someone else entirely. Years ago, her name wasn't just Elena. Years ago, there was a call sign that made enemies whisper, a reputation carved into the cold of midnight operations and the dust of unmarked battlefields. But that belonged to another lifetime, or so she thought. On nights when exhaustion stole her strength, she would sit by the dim lantern light, fingers raw from stitching, staring at her reflection in the rippling plastic of the water barrels. 28, she'd think. Too young to feel this old, too old to start over. She never let anyone see her cry. Tears belonged to weaker days, days she'd buried. But loneliness has a way of pressing itself into the bones, and hers ached from carrying it. Still, she endured, because she knew that in a world held together by fragile ropes and torn canvas, someone had to care enough to keep patching the holes. And so she did, without thanks, without recognition, without anyone realizing that every knot she tied, every flap she secured, was practice, silent, patient practice for a life she'd promised herself she would never return to. She thought she'd buried it. She thought no one remembered. She thought the director had forgotten her name. But storms have a way of tearing the world open, and trunks have a way of unlocking themselves when the past comes knocking. And so, for now, the others laughed at the woman who patched leaks, the one they dismissed as maintenance. They didn't know the difference between maintenance and survival. They didn't know that every scar on her hand was a map, every glance over her shoulder a calculation, every silence a shield. They didn't know that one day soon, when the night was darkest and the rain hardest, her quiet life would shatter with a single message, and the woman they thought they knew would be gone forever. But that part of the story hasn't come yet. For now, Elena worked alone, bent over torn fabric, the storm above raging like a test she had already passed 1,000 times before. And if you'd walked by her that night, you would have thought nothing of it. You would have seen only a tired young woman fighting canvas and wind. But you would have been wrong. Because in that moment, without knowing it, you would have been standing in the presence of horizon mist. The storm that night was different. The rain wasn't just rain. It was a hammer, battering the canvas walls, driving needles of water through every seam, flooding the muddy ground until the whole depot seemed to groan under its weight. Elena had stayed behind, as always, while the younger workers laughed their way into the barracks, leaving her alone in the sea of tents. She crouched low, her hands raw and blistered, pressing a final patch in a place along a shelter seam that refused to stay shut. The glue burned her fingers, but she didn't wince. Pain was a language she spoke fluently, one she hadn't forgotten from years before. She pulled the flap tight, secured the ropes with a practiced twist, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. That's when the vibration started, not from the ground, not from the storm, but from the small, cracked comm device strapped to her belt. Elena froze. The device had been silent for years, dormant, ignored, its battery barely kept alive by her habit of charging it once every few weeks, a ritual she pretended meant nothing. But now the screen flickered, dull lights struggling against the storm's darkness, and a single message appeared in block letters that stole the air from her lungs. Directive, horizon mist. Suit up. Her heart stopped, then thundered so hard she thought it might break through her chest. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen, the words glowing like firebrands, like ghosts. Horizon mist. A name she hadn't heard in almost 7 years. A name she had buried with her old life, the one she swore she'd never return to. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from recognition, from the memory of what it meant to be called that. She closed her eyes, and the depot dissolved. The rain vanished. The storm became another storm, years ago, when she was 21 and crouched behind cover in a desert that smelled of smoke and iron, when orders crackled in her ear, and she answered not as Elena, but as horizon mist. She had thought it was over then. She had thought she had earned the right to live quietly, to patch tents instead of wounds, to sleep without a weapon under her pillow. But the director's words weren't a request. They were a summons, and summons were never ignored. Her breathing grew steady, automatic, the way it used to before deployment. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The tired depot worker vanished. In her place, the old instincts slid back into place like blades finding their sheaths. She looked around the tent, scanning for eyes, for ears, for anyone who might have noticed. But the depot was silent save for the storm. She was alone, just as she had been countless nights in the past. Slowly, she tucked the comm device back against her belt, shielding the screen, and moved through the rows of supplies as if nothing had changed. But everything had. When she reached the farthest corner, she stopped at the trunk. That battered, forgotten trunk that everyone assumed was junk. Elena crouched, fingers brushing away the layers of dust and mud that clung to it. The lock was still there, the metal rusted and scarred, but it was no obstacle. From her pocket, she pulled a key no one knew she carried. Not the kind you hang on a chain, but thin, jagged, filed by her own hand years ago, hidden in the lining of her jacket. She slid it into the lock. It turned with a groan, as though the trunk itself knew it was waking from slumber. The lid lifted, and the smell hit her first. Oil, leather, iron, the scent of a life sealed away. Inside lay what the others had dismissed as scrap, her past, waiting. Tactical armor, black and gray, still folded with precision. Weathered boots that had carried her across deserts, mountains, jungles. A visor with the faint outline of her old unit's insignia, a shape worn smooth from years of use. She reached in and pulled out the chest piece, heavier than she remembered, her fingers tracing the dents, each one a memory, a reminder of why she had left. Elena sat back on her heels, armor in her lap, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel the weight of who she had been. 28, she thought again, old enough to know better, young enough to still be asked. The director had called, and calls like this were never made lightly. Something was happening, something vast enough to pull her out of hiding, something dangerous enough to demand Horizon Mist. Her reflection glinted in the visor's cracked edge. She didn't see the weary tent patcher staring back. She saw the operative she'd fought to forget, the one who had made decisions that haunted her, the one who had carried lives in her hands, the one who had walked away because staying would have destroyed her. She had sworn never to be her again. But the message was clear. The world didn't care about her vows. The world needed her, whether she wanted it or not. Thunder cracked, shaking the depot. Elena slipped the visor back into the trunk, then pulled out her old gloves, sliding them on with deliberate precision. They fit as though no time had passed, as though her body had been waiting for this all along. She tightened the straps, her movements smooth, instinctual, the kind you don't unlearn. She rose slowly, armor clutched against her chest, her eyes narrowing. The rain still pounded the canvas, but it no longer sounded like a storm. It sounded like drums, calling her back. For the first time in years, Elena smiled. Not the polite smile of a worker dismissed, but the grim, knowing smile of someone stepping into their true skin. The depot might still see her as the woman who patched leaks, but that illusion was ending. The director's words were in order, and Horizon Mist never ignored orders. And so, alone in the storm, Elena began to prepare. The depot was silent, save for the storm's endless roar, but inside Elena's chest the silence broke. Every beat of her heart was louder now, sharper, like it was keeping cadence with something ancient and inevitable. She stood in the far corner of the tent, armor in hand, the battered trunk yawning open like a wound that had never really healed. The ordinary world of tarps and ropes and glue patches fell away piece by piece, replaced by the gravity of what lay before her. For years she had lived with her head bowed, content to stitch fabric and sweep mud, pretending the past had been buried. But the director's summons had unearthed it in seconds. Horizon Mist was not dead. Horizon Mist had only been sleeping. She slid the armor on, each strap cinched tight with the precision of memory. The weight grounded her, pulled her spine straighter, and with it came the shift, the slow unraveling of the disguise she'd worn for so long. The tired worker who patched leaks was gone. In her place stood a woman honed by years of shadows, forged in silence, sculpted by missions no one would ever know. She pulled her gloves taut, flexed her fingers, and the movements came back as though no time had passed. The roll of her shoulders, the steadying breath before action, the quiet focus that erased hesitation. She bent down and laced her boots, tugging them tight until the leather creaked, until she could feel the ground itself like an old friend. In the trunk's bottom, beneath the armor, lay a single folded cloth. She hesitated before touching it, her hand trembling for the first time. She unfolded it slowly, and there it was, the insignia of her old unit. The mark of a ghost team whispered about in corridors of power, denied in official reports, and feared in corners of the world most people would never see. She pressed the insignia against her chest, closing her eyes. For a moment she was 21 again, young, reckless, stepping into her first mission with fire in her veins. But she wasn't 21 anymore. She was 28. Older, scarred, tempered by loss, but sharper for it. This wasn't a rebirth. It was a reckoning. Lightning cracked, throwing her shadow long against the canvas walls. And in that jagged light her silhouette wasn't that of a depot worker. It was a soldier, a phantom, a name carried on the storm. Horizon Mist. She stood taller, adjusted her visor, and as the glass slid down over her eyes the world shifted tint, sharper, clearer, like looking through the lens of her true self. The noise of the storm fell away, distant, irrelevant. She could hear her own breath, steady and unbroken. She could hear the hum of the comm device at her hip, alive now in a way it hadn't been for years. Her gaze swept the depot with new clarity. The stacked crates weren't just crates. They were potential cover, obstacles, tactical points. The tents weren't just shelters. They were choke points, corridors, exits. She saw it all, the way she always had, the way she had trained to see. Every angle, every risk, every possibility. She had been pretending to be ordinary, but the truth was she could never stop seeing the world this way. That was why the director had sent the message. That was why she had been chosen again. Elena's chest tightened as she thought of the others, the ones she had served with, the ones who had not lived to step back into the quiet. Their faces flashed before her, unbidden, Shadows of the fallen who had been her family. She clenched her fists, and the gloves creaked with the force. For them, she told herself. For the ones who couldn't answer the call anymore. For the ones who never got a second chance. She closed the trunk, sealing it with a final snap of the lock, though now it was empty, its secrets claimed. The comm device buzzed once more, a silent pulse against her hip. She tapped it, and a set of coordinates lit the screen, precise and urgent, glowing against the dark. She memorized them in an instant. No explanation, no details. The director never wasted words. Just a location, just an order. Suit up and move. That was enough. She took one last look at the depot, the flapping canvas, the muddy ground, the patched seams she had mended night after night. For a moment, her chest ached with something like grief. She had poured herself into this place, into keeping it alive, even if no one noticed. It had been her refuge, her penance, her disguise. But she knew now it was only ever a waiting room. Horizon Mist did not belong here. Horizon Mist belonged to the storm. Elena stepped out into the night, the rain slamming against her armor, rolling off like it feared her. The mud clung to her boots, but she walked with purpose, cutting across the depot grounds as though the storm itself had risen to salute her return. Workers peered through tent flaps, catching glimpses of her silhouette, but none recognized her. To them she was still the woman who fixed leaks. They had no idea that the figure striding through the deluge carried a name that once tilted the balance of conflicts they'd never hear about. The sky split with thunder, and in that white flash her form was stark and undeniable, a lone warrior against the fury of the storm. The depot behind her faded into shadow, and the world ahead loomed vast and uncertain. She didn't know what awaited at the coordinates, what crisis had forced the director to call her back, but she didn't need to. She only knew this. When the world trembled, Horizon Mist answered. And so she walked on, armor gleaming beneath the storm, visor lit faintly with the glow of her call sign. Elena, the tent patcher, was gone. Horizon Mist had returned. The night held its breath,